Hey everyone. I am so excited to see you all here. I am looking through our list of chat here where we have people from all over the world. So there's several I can see from the US. We have North Carolina, Portland, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Arizona. We have Netherlands, Chester in the UK, and we of course have some from Ireland. So I very much want to welcome you all over to us. It's particularly exciting to be able to welcome Vawn Corrigan here. I will tell you a little about our history. Vaughan, I met virtually by phone a couple of years, well, several years ago, because time moves very quickly, when she was researching her first book, which was Irish Aran. And I talked through about my experience with Aran and my little part of the history that I knew, but that was just a small little segment of all of this history that Vaughan was collecting on it. So that was her first book, which was Irish Aran. And the second book she's done, which was kind of a continuation into the textile history of Ireland, was on, let me remember, it was Irish Tweed. Both of those have been published by O'Brien's Press, which is an Irish publishing company, and they are sold through O'Brien's, all good booksellers, and Vaughan also does it directly herself. So I would like to introduce Vaughan here, and you are so welcome.
Hi, Carol. Lovely to meet you, everybody. Lovely to know that you're out there. Hope you're having a good day and looking forward to chatting.
So today, what we're going to go, I want to make sure that I've actually got the full picture here. Oh, hang on a second. I'll see if it is live. I wanted to make sure that I actually have the picture going correctly and that it's seen. Let me know if there is any problems or it's not coming up because there's a slight delay. So I need to make sure that it's visible to everybody as we're going through. So what we're going to talk about today is the history of Irish knitting. And a lot of people assume it's all about Aran and all of the rest, but that's just a tiny portion of it. And it's a relatively new section of Irish knitting, really, which surprises people. So I'm going to open the floor to Vaughan to perhaps give a little bit of insight into the history and into what in her experience Irish knitting is.
Oh, okay. Well, the way it happened was that to understand Irish knitting, it's important to understand a little bit about Irish politics. Is that Ireland, we didn't get our independence till around the 1920s, and not until a little later than that. And prior to that time, and particularly going back through the centuries, we were under English government. So Ireland was primarily used to grow food and crops for the armies of Britain. So industry was very much neglected. Now, there had been a time further back before where we had a very well-developed wool industry, but it was crushed with legislation in the 17th and 18th centuries. So the wool trade was annihilated, and so we had a situation where we had a population without very much work and industry, and we had the culmination of all of these things came together to produce the unfair system that Ireland was under, produced the famine. And after the famine, textiles were reinvigorated. The Irish wool trade was reinvigorated, and it was a very good fit for Ireland. But we have to bounce again. Sorry if this is sort of going ba-doing, ba-doing. We're going to bounce around a bit to say that the reason why Irish knitting got such a big profile and really has been so well known all over the world was because we already had a long history of creating textiles. We already had a long history of excellence in textiles. And this would go back to Irish poplin, silk poplin, which was woven in Dublin by the Huguenots. And this was exported all over Europe. So we were renowned for the silk poplin and the weavers. Then we had linen. We were very well known for our linen. And this was all quality cloth for the top market. So it was developed for the export traded. And after the famine, when we had a broken country, a broken-hearted country with disease and poverty and so on. Groups of philanthropic women got together and decided to promote lace making as a way of raising up the poor, because you really didn't need much. You just, a hook and some linen yarn, and away you could go. At that time, lace was already being made in the machines in England. So this was a niche quality product, very niche, handmade lace made in the villages of Ireland. And this, the way it was so successful, sort of drove ahead what came after that, which was the invigoration of the weaving tradition, which really, really took off in the 19th century. And because we had such a strong reputation for export and an export market developed through our lace and our weaving, it wasn't much of a leap to go to the knitting at all. Plus, we were already working with wool because of all the weaving, and we had a lot of sheep. So it was just a very, very good fit for Ireland.
Can I ask actually, because I mean, one thing you never think about in Ireland is the fact that because we're such a small country, that export and import are not something new. That obviously this is like we've always been a country that has brought things in, because I assume the silk and the and the linen, were they both imported, that they worked on before the finished products were exported?
Yeah, we had trade has always been very good in Ireland because we've
Yeah.
got very safe natural harbours. So we were always a very good trading country and very outward looking as a small island, So there was always a lot of trade. I mean, when the English government banned the export of wool, we became smugglers, and we continued to smuggle the wool out. But then when we had other products to trade, for example, we had the big port of Cork. Once the colonies were established, we could trade very easily that way across. And so silk poplin was our first big export. And when the if you look at tweed and lace, which came before Irish knitting in terms of major big export, I'm talking about. These were developed with a market in mind already. They were developed by well-connected people, and they were often developed in a philanthropic way to help the poor. There was something called the Congested District Board from the late 19th century, late 1800s. And this was set up to encourage weaving and making with textiles to give employment to the poor. But when it was established, the market was established in tandem with it. So our biggest trade would have always been England initially, but when it comes to our textiles and our finer goods, it was America. And the American market was opened up significantly to Irish textiles during the Chicago Fair in the 19th century by Alice Hart and Lady Aberdeen Chicago Fair. They created a replica Irish village, and they brought over lace makers and knitters and weavers and craftspeople, and they sold so much that they had enough money to open up a permanent depot in Chicago, and another one in New York followed. So the American trade has been important for much longer than people can imagine. Yeah, and without that trade, and particularly later on when we rely as a very small country, traditionally often quite poor, we're doing well at the moment, but our biggest
Historically not.
our biggest export was human beings, really. And so without that trade, nothing would survive. Nothing would have survived. And we depended on the luxury markets, which became in later years after America, would have become Japan, Germany, and Australia, countries like that really valued good quality textiles and the Irish connection.
Yeah, no, it never ceases to amaze me how things that you think are relatively modern have got such deep roots. I totally derailing you probably now, but in terms of, I remember hearing about this, but the fact that we were banned from exporting, or was it exporting or for producing woven goods?
Exporting.
exporting.
a trade of the woolen goods, which had been a traditional source of wealth in the medieval period. And yeah. Mm.
And the reasoning behind that was to just control the population, or
No, the reasoning behind the ban on the export of wool by the English government at the time was because it threatened English manufacturing.
okay,
It threatened the English wool producers, and they put pressure on the king to put a ban on our exporting of wool. We were too
okay.
successful, which is an interesting point, because a lot of the time I often think with Ireland, and I'm not a historian, it's, this is very much a social history, but
Hmm.
a lot of the time I think you can think of Ireland as before the famine and after the famine,
Hmm.
because a lot of the time our perceptions of Ireland are only shaped by after the famine,
Yeah,
where everyone is very poor and struggling. And actually, that, if you look back, that really isn't the whole story. There's a
yeah.
much more nuanced story
Hmm.
around Irish economy, Irish making, and so on.
Yeah. And what was the timing of the ban then? Was that was
Um,
before the famine,
Oh,
or
the timing of the ban on wool
yeah.
was before the famine. Yes, it was in the. I could actually get the date up for you in a minute, quickly. Um, and then what happened with another side to the ban in the export of wool was that they decided to promote linen for Ireland. They saw linen as a good fit for Ireland.
Hmm.
A good fit because the wages were lower in Ireland, and it was very, very labor intensive compared to
Okay.
wool production. And what happened was they gave out a lot of looms, or particularly in the northeast, they gave out a lot of looms and encouraged flax to be grown all over the country. So at certain points in Ireland, we had flax growing everywhere. Actually, flax was grown in Ireland right up until the 1960s.
Oh,
Now
wow.
it's no longer grown except in very small artisanal ways.
Hmm.
Um, because it is very labor intensive and difficult to work, and the amount of flax you have to have, any weavers out there listening will know, how much flax it takes to create a linen thread. So yeah, so the idea was to introduce linen, and linen was hobbled right from the get-go by political turmoil in the country, and it wasn't as well suited to Ireland as wool. And in the end, when it did generate wealth, because it became our luxury product,
Hmm.
many older people will remember it was the gift, a very luxurious gift was Irish linen. It was given to royalty and so on. It was a very beautiful linen, very fine linen. But the wealth remained only in the hands of a few, whereas prior to that, I'm talking around the 16th, 18th century, the wealth was a little bit better distributed through wool. Mm.
That's yeah. It's fascinating. Is there still any linen production up in the north of the country?
Um, Sorry, there is a little, but nothing to speak of. There's linen
Yeah.
weaving.
Hmm.
There's linen weaving, but the linen is mostly produced in Belgium.
Yeah, as there was a couple of months ago, I went down to visit the Khmer lace because they were talking about the lace, and I suppose that's very similar kind of story to the Irish knitwear as well, isn't it? In terms of how that got started.
That's right. Yeah. Sorry, I was just having a little Google for the date. My brain is not great for the date. I was going, now exactly when was that ban on wool introduced? So yeah.
Well, it's all relative is handy because just even knowing it was before the famine can
Oh
place it in
yeah.
terms of the timeline of where it
During, yes,
happens.
absolutely. Late 17th century.
Yeah.
Mm.
But yeah, so the lace making, because I know that there's like the Kenmare lace and that what's I but would that have been around the same time as knitwear started to be produced as a luxury item here in Ireland?
The lace, all of the laces really, um, nearly all of our laces were developed and expanded in the 19th century in
Hmm.
response to poverty. All of them were set up, with the exception of Limerick lace, they were all set up more or less philanthropically as fair trade enterprises. And although lace making did exist in Ireland prior to that, actually we did a lot of embroidery as well,
Hmm.
but it wasn't on that scale. So the lace schools were all developed around the 19th century, whereas at that point knitting was still very much, I'm going to say, rudimentary. People often say, like, why was it we didn't do more knitting? Because if you look at countries like Norway, that they were knitting all the way back, whereas in Ireland seemed to be pretty late coming into knitting. I think it's because we had such a well-developed weaving culture. We had a lot of home weaving, and I think the cloth, the combination of linen weave and woven wool, suited the purpose well enough. And knitting was more or less for smaller items like hats and socks and undergarments and so on. And then it was, so we didn't have what you would call luxury knitting as such. We had functional knitting, which is why we've got so little of it left, unfortunately, because it was worn, loved, worn out, unraveled, worn again. Whereas we've still got lace going back. We've kept our lace because it's considered more valuable. I have an Aran sweater here, and this would have been, this is a kind of a typical of the original Arans. This Aran is around my age. So,
oh, it's beautiful.
yeah. So you can see that it's knitted in the Irish wool, which gives it that great definition on the stitches that you
Which
don't.
is probably like the Galway sheep or something like that would be a fairly common one.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And the texture of it is what, actually, I think the Galway might be a little softer than this. This is kind of a bit scratchy. So it might be black-faced.
Yeah.
And then they used to sew these little wooden buttons on them, which are great.
Beautiful.
So, yeah, so that's quite,
Beautiful.
unfortunately, we don't have a great deal of old sweaters to look back
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
And some of the older ones really are a little indistinguishable from the Scottish Ganseys. And then it kind of morphed on the Aran Islands to become its own thing. And all
Yeah.
of a sudden, anything with a cable in it was Irish Aran, Whereas before that, it was quite a widespread pattern among the fishing community of Europe.
Well, it's
Yeah.
functional because I mean when I've had conversations with people talking about like the history of Aran, and I get them to think about that if it was meant to be created for fishermen, it doesn't make any sense because first of all it's very decorative, which means that it's both very heavy and it's going to be something that you keep for good wear like the linen. So that, like, the Gansey style makes sense because the top part's a little bit decorative and all the rest of it then is just plain so that it's not going to get in the way. So it looks decorative rather than functional.
Yeah. Yeah.
So was it Chicago was the first time that Aran knits really became a thing?
No, the Chicago Fair was the first time that we really established an Irish textile market in America.
Okay, but they were being produced before that.
Yeah, the Aran sweater, the Chicago Square was in the late 1800s, and the Aran sweater was not part of it. It was weaving and lace making, and
Okay.
some of our other crafts, which have actually fallen by blacksmithing and making sugaun chairs and so on. So what happened with the Aran knit, and there was some knitting, but it wasn't in the shape of Aran. And what they were knitting a lot in Ireland at that time in the late 1800s was, quite nice decorative socks with patterns down the back, and there was nice knitting going on. But because there was the Ganseys and the Aran Islands, as you're saying, the working costumes of the Aran men, and they were normally dyed dark to functional clothing. But they also always had a sense of style, like you say, a working garment. But it was well known that the Aran Islanders took a great pride in their style. They had a different style and they knew it and they liked it. So they carried on dressing in a way which was quite different to the mainland, but they knew they liked it. They knew they had something. So there was a bit of a swagger in their fishermen's ganseys. Like there was a way that the young men started wearing them in a fashionable way, because it was around the time when it was sort of beginning to morph, was around the time that sweaters were actually kind of coming into their own generally, in England and so on, with Fair sweaters with were being worn and so on. So anyway, where the intricate knitting took place, I know you know all of this, Carol. Is this so probably just repetition of stuff you know already? It's like, oh
you'd be
yeah.
surprised. I have big gaps in my knowledge, so I'm really enjoying hearing this from your words.
Well, they were doing very original, very unique kind of patterns and unique to their families, and it was a way that women were able to express their creativity just like it is now. I mean, it's a great outlet for women, and they didn't have perhaps an access to a whole load of other ways to display their artistry. So it was something they could take pride in, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And Muriel Gahan went to the Aran Islands in the 1930s, I think it was 1930, and she saw the sweaters that were being knitted for the young fellas by the mothers for their communion. And they were always knitted in white, because then they could make really lovely fancy stitches, and the stitches would show up really nicely. And so the white is the color of communion and confirmation, the color of purity. So they were using white. And when Muriel Gahan saw them, she liked them and the kris, you know, the woven kris. She saw them as two products of the Aran Island that were unique, that would actually do really well on the mainstream market. And at that point, she'd opened up a shop in Dublin. So she said, if you knit them in adult sizes, I can sell them in Dublin. So they did, and they sold well. And as soon as they sold well, the women on the Aran Islands, who were already quite good at trade and had been trading already as much as they could within the confines of the fact that it was tricky to get off and on those islands in those days, you know, they didn't have piers. Sometimes they'd be cut off and everything. But anyway, they started going over to Galway market with their bags of Aran sweaters and selling them. So the women drove it forward, and then people loved it. And then, of course, it became a symbol of Irishness and traveled the world. But when it traveled the world, it could not continue to be knitted. It was never knitted to a very large scale on the Aran Islands, because the scale needed to meet the demand was so huge.
Yeah.
And the Aran Islands are so small and still so underpopulated that it had to be the places where we already had that making in wool culture going on, such as the Donegal, because they were weaving and they were working with wool all the time, and they were already fine knitters. So the style of Aran spread around Ireland, and it became Irish knitting, and it spread to Cork. As you know, there's a big scene in Cork. Yeah, I don't know if you've got that picture I can show of Blarney Woolen Mills.
I have, if you keep talking, I'm going to see if I can find it up here, because I know that I'll see if I can find it popping up. Is it the first one? I've got the one of Marilyn Monroe here, and there's a few. Oh, here's the Blarney Woolen Mills. Okay, let me see if I'm able to share that now.
Yeah, the reason why I wanted to show this to you guys was, I suppose, to kind of to put it into a visualization of how big and how important woolen mills were in Ireland. We had a lot of them. We've very few left now, unfortunately. So this one here, Blarney Woolen Mills, established in 1823, that would have been spinning and also producing textiles and finishing textiles. But these places were very significant in the story of knitting because of us spinning lots of yarn and having all of these wool spinners all over the country. We were able to produce the weaving, the beautiful woven tweed cloth, blankets, uniform fabric, you name it, was woven out of wool. But also this was a resource that made the Aran industry possible, was that we had woolen mills producing so much great yarn and so many women who were already very highly skilled in knitting. It was like a perfect combo. So what would happen is, can you see, that's the woolen mills. Generations would have worked in those woolen mills, you know. You'd had the fathers and the sons and the moms, and textiles was always big for women. So if we're looking at that picture, that's the oldest oldest extant Aran knit we have in Ireland, and that in the museum, and that's the one that traveled to New York to the MoMA exhibition of
Which one is this?
significant objects.
Hang on, I'm going to stop that share of the first one. And is it one of the other ones you'd like me to share there?
Oh,
Um,
you actually did have it up.
oh, I did. Oh, sorry. It was at this one here of the picture of the boys and
Yeah,
the men with the.
yeah,
Okay,
and
yeah,
that
yeah.
one, that is the oldest extant Aran in Ireland.
And it looks
Um,
quite, it's actually more decorative. Like, so it's got a more female feel to it, doesn't it? The fact that you've got kind of the baubles and almost floral patterns in the front.
Yeah,
Um,
that was Muriel Gahan had a shop in Dublin called the Country Shop, I think it was called, and this sweater came from there.
mhm,
And at that time, there used to be competitions to see who could produce the best Aran knit.
yeah,
And the Aran knitters of the day, I'm talking 1930s, 40s, 50s, they had so many different designs, so many.
mhm,
And what happened was eventually it kind of honed down to what we
yeah.
have now. But there
But
are
it was much
still,
more diverse.
it was more diverse and more
Hmm.
individualistic.
Yeah, and I actually
Yeah,
love the idea because I've heard the idea of each one being able to like almost being like a signature for fishermen if they're drowned and all that. Like while that's not true, but it is still individualistic, and each of those knitters, I think, very much felt like this is my stitch. They had an ownership over the stitch patterns.
they did. And they evolved their own stitches.
Yeah.
And I met well, before I say what I was going to say, I just want to point out that in the image beside the Aran sweater, you'll see it's not a very good image, but you'll see that the boys are wearing white knitted
Hmm.
sweaters, whereas the men are wearing a kind of a uniform of the Aran Islanders there, which is all woven, and the ganzis that they'd be wearing underneath would be dark. But
Yeah.
then it ended up becoming something that adults wore, and it
Hmm.
grew in that way.
Yeah.
But what were you saying there? What was the point there?
Um, good question. What
Oh,
was I
you were
saying?
saying,
Oh, I was talking about the fact that the stitch
oh,
patterns
yes,
are
that's it.
they've
Yes,
become the women really had ownership, and they there was a very much like this is my stitch pattern
that's
that
right. Yeah.
they internalized. So it was
Yeah.
it,
This is my
which
stitch pattern. And I met an elderly lady actually through my partner's family. And she was living in Limerick.
hmm
And she lived in a rural area in Limerick. And she knitted for the Aran industry.
hmm
And she was disgusted when one of her stitches, that you see, the way it used to work was, well, I'm going to have to do another jump. Ta-doing. There's after we got independence, because we'd already done such a good job of selling textiles, and because weaving and knitting was such a good fit for the rural poor and were a
hmm
good source of income in a country without much employment. Our government, the Irish government, decided to continue with this and decided to continue subsidizing the woolen mills, subsidizing the spinning, and subsidizing knitting. And so the way it would work is that the Gael Torah Aran agent, which was usually a knitter and a woman,
hmm
would go to the area to all the knitters, and she would give them the wool and she would give them a pattern. And then she would cut, they would bring all of their knit to a central area, and then they'd get paid per piece. If they made mistakes, they'd have to take it back and fix it and bring it back the following week, kind of thing. But she was disgusted because she'd innovated a knit, and about 2 months later, it ended up on the patterns that they were all being given.
Oh.
So she lost ownership of it. But you will find now that what's happened is on the islands, they will label it with their name. And now, if you
Mhm.
order a hand knit Aran, you'll always know who's made it. So it does have a very personal relationship.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that continues. So there is honor to the knitter.
Hmm.
It's so unfortunate that there's so few of them left, really,
Yeah, it
unfortunately. Yeah.
is. Yeah, yeah, it is. And I mean, just the work they produce is just so incredible. And I mean, the great thing is, like, I know there are not many, but it is still being done, which is great.
It is
Um,
still being done. There's a great interest in it. There's a growing interest in it among the younger generation. It seems to have skipped a
Yeah.
generation or something,
Yeah.
because there was a high standard of knitting in Ireland, even in the up to the late 80s, and
Hmm.
many schools taught knitting.
Hmm.
So
I
there
learned
was
it in
some.
school.
Did you? Yeah,
I
yeah.
did. I did. Yep.
My partner learned it in school. They even taught it to boys
Hmm.
because, when you were knitting errands, the whole family were often involved. Like the kids might be knitting the cuffs or whatever.
Hmm.
I remember giving a talk, and I give talks and slideshows in libraries and so on around the place. I normally
Hmm.
show images and then chat about them, but I also do a little bit of a show and tell. And sometimes I like to ask the women, are any of you in here, you were knitting errands? And they say, yes, yes. And I'd say, well, were you professional knitters? And no hands would go up. And
Yep.
I'd say, did you used to sell your errands? And up the hands would go. And I said, you used to knit to the degree that you could sell your errands professionally, but you don't consider
That's
yourself
profession.
professional.
Yeah.
Because the cottage industry had this sort of, it wasn't really valued,
Hmm.
even though it gave women great agency.
Yeah, because it
And
was usually
yeah,
done on the side or in the evening or
yeah,
while you were doing something else. And I think that women, even still now, are hand knitting or hand knits are still very undervalued because a lot of people consider it's like, oh, I'm doing it while I'm doing something else. So it doesn't occur to them that that time is the most valuable thing you have. Um,
absolutely.
yeah,
And
so
I
it's
mean, we tend to value our musicians and our writers more than our makers. And that's something that's shifting as well.
mhm,
It's part of, I'd hesitate to call it a folk revival, but it's something like that, where you
yeah,
have really young women taking up really old crafts
mhm,
and instruments. It's happening musically as well. More
yeah,
young women are learning the harp and so on. And so there's an interest in turning back. Like when I look at the Irish knitting, I see that there's kind of two paths of it, if you like. What happened was it was a very widespread cottage industry.
mhm,
You could gather together a team of 200 people, even in a remote rural area, and you could export your product. It was that good, and there were that many of them. What astonished me when I researched Irish Aran, which was just how widespread it was and how
mhm,
big it was,
mhm,
because we were exporting so much all over the world. So this was a very significant part of women's life. It's a very big story, if you like. But the story wouldn't have been possible without the woolen mills supporting them by producing the yarn and without the government support, which all goes back to how textiles helped Ireland, after the famine. So, like,
mhm.
it's really part of our history. And our making has nearly always been small and artisanal. We don't have what the UK had with the big factories and big manufacturing. We've
Yeah.
always been small. We've got hardly any woolen mills left, but what we do have is very, very good. In some ways, we've got more that some other European countries have because it was supported by the government for longer.
I mean, considering how small the country is in terms of population, having the number we do is kind of astonishing. Because I know even in the States, for instance, the mills are just dwindling. So it's because so much of it is done from abroad. Whereas I suppose if you have to appreciate the fact if it's Irishness, not just based on cost, but on the quality and the unique quality it has, so that it has value by being Irish, not just because it's the cheapest wool you can get, or that its origin has to have value of its own, I think.
Yeah, its origin does have value of its own, that's for sure,
Yeah.
and that's what's the added extra element in making. Sometimes hand knitters, and I don't know if you guys would agree with this or not, but sometimes hand knitters tend to have a very almost disparaging view of machine knitting because they view it as just mass production. But it isn't all like that. Like we have knitting companies that are producing machine made knits in Ireland,
Mhm.
such as this one here.
I think that it's if it's not being passed off as a hand knit, people have no problem with it.
Yeah,
It's when people are graying the lines between the two that you run into problems.
that's a very good point.
Um,
Absolutely. But I was going to say with the Irish making of machine knits is that there's usually quite a lot of hand work and hand
mhm.
finishing, so
Yep.
that they're not mass produced. They're
Yeah.
small produced,
It's produced by hand with a machine is
produced by
probably
hand
more
with a
apt.
machine. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's still room for that. And a lot of hand knitters work in knitting factories, small
Hmm.
knitting factories, and offer their expertise. So the two are not entirely disconnected. The
Yeah.
designs in one are brought into the other, and in Ireland, I think there's a good working relationship
Hmm.
between the designers of hand knit and machine. A lot of knitwear designers are able to work quite comfortably in knitwear machine factories. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't gotten there myself yet. Maybe someday I'll get there. But there was because I do a lot of work with Donegal yarns, and
Mm,
I was up they had an open day this summer, and the person I was sitting next to an Irish knitwear company next to me, and what was incredible is that they produced all of their knitwear up in Donegal. Like it was 100% Irish made, and to me that is has as much value as what I'm doing. It's different, but like it's being made in Ireland by, not shipped abroad saying it was designed in Ireland, like Apple with their designed in
yeah.
California. But it's,
Mhm.
that it's produced from start to finish here in Ireland, regardless of
Yeah.
how it happened to be produced. It does have just as much value.
That's
I'm
right,
going,
and we also need to protect that and
yeah.
safeguard it and have it properly so that people can't just pretend, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah,
I'm looking down here. I know there's a couple of oh, so you answered one of them. There was one someone was saying this what were the men wearing the vests of, and of course you answered that afterwards, so that was already answered.
yeah,
And there so I didn't know, you may have heard this. Kate Daly was saying she read that the 17th century specific colors were banned, such as bui, the color yellow, one of the first colors associated with the Irish. Um,
yes. There was also a whole load of bans. Thanks for mentioning that. Very interesting subject. That Irish costume itself was banned. We traditionally wore a long cloak called a brat, and this was worn over a long linen garment,
mhm,
and we'd have tied belts onto it with bags and so on. And this traditional style of Irish dress was outlawed entirely by the Tudors, um, first with Henry and Elizabeth, the
mhm.
kings, king and queen, absolutely outlawed Irish dress entirely. Yeah.
Just to kind of
So
to
there were,
bring us
yeah.
more under under the English influence, presumably.
Well, what happened was they needed to control Ireland because of the Spanish situation and the French. You see,
Yes.
they were at war, so they needed us on their side. And at that time, the only way that it was considered that you could be English enough was by speaking English and dressing like an Englishman. So Irish clothing became associated with the rebels.
Hmm.
That actually didn't stop people wearing it, despite the fact that they had to pay fines for wearing Irish dress. And there was a whole load of legislation around what Irish people could and couldn't do, which
Hmm.
was part of conforming to the English way. In
Yeah.
terms of the colours, specific colours being banned, actually there were so many little fiddly, weird, and ever-changing bans on garments and textiles, even down to the way women wore their hair, and
Oh,
they
really?
kept, yeah, the Irish style of dress. You know, during the reign of Elizabeth, when Grania Whale went over, which would have been in the 16th century, Grania Whale wore an Irish mantle,
Hmm.
and she wore a big Irish brooch in the traditional way, and she wore her hair loose with gold ornaments, which was the Irish way. So she flouted all the rules that had been laid down. It seems perverse to us now, doesn't it? It's like really have to go back in time to understand that.
Yeah, just and I mean, like the most recent, the idea of the Irish language being wiped out, and the religion, I suppose, is the one that's more. They're the ones that are most obvious. But like dress and the way you wore your hair just seems incredible because I actually hadn't realized how deep it all went.
Yes, how deep it went and how pervasive it was. And then, yeah, I mean, politics and textiles are always very close together. You could really
Hmm.
study one by
Yeah,
studying the other. Because
and
many
I
many of the craft, like the textile heritage, like including lace making in Europe, but in Ireland, our poplin silk weaving was brought over by refugees. So there's
mhm,
a whole movement of people bringing with them different skills. But
yeah,
in the case of the Aran sweater, it was definitely more connected with the fishing community
yeah.
and the Scottish. That's
Yeah.
how that particular wave went.
And I'm actually there's a photograph you had that I might pop up if you want, the kind of moving it into kind of more modern day, the one you have of Marilyn, if you want me
Yeah.
to pop that up, if I can find it now. I have it here somewhere, and is it going to, where are you? I can't find it now. I've got it showing up here, but it's not, it doesn't want to show on my share. I'll try one more
Yeah.
time. Here we go, got it.
This photo is interesting because it shows the reason why Aran carried was because of all the celebrity endorsement of all these, important people, and how far it traveled from being a kind of an innocent little garment on a remote fishing island with a poor fishing community to become associated with the most glamorous and powerful people in the world is a fascinating story. Starting off here and ending up right over there.
Yeah,
And
we've got
then
it
you've
in
got
the,
all the designers producing interesting errands. One point I think is interesting for knitters is that if you see the sweater on the left in 1950, Aran's sweater is not dissimilar to the one that we just looked at, which is the earliest one from the 1930. But it's actually still quite like the Scottish fishing gansies. Whereas the one 10 years later on Marilyn Monroe, you would still buy today in Irish
and
shops
particularly the honeycomb up the middle is something that you see all the time
all
with
the
the
time.
stitch patterns now, which
Yeah,
makes a much denser fabric,
yeah,
much thicker, whereas the other one is kind of more diamonds and a little kind of
yeah.
a flatter stitch.
That's right. And once it changed, once it settled, if you like. Now, in the 60s, they were still doing crazy stuff with Aran. They were making Aran pantsuits and Aran bell bottoms. And, I'm not saying we were all going around in gansies, but there was this idea of what an Aran was that kind of solidified in 1960. And then it just didn't really change.
Yeah,
But that's not unusual. There's a lot of things that hit a certain point and they just don't change because they just kind of get classic. And you go like,
yeah,
why would you change it? You
yeah.
could tweak it a bit, but it
Yeah,
works.
no, I know what you mean, that it's like that's became the defining thing about Aran. Is like it's not an Aran unless it's got X, Y, and Z in it. It has to be
Yeah,
this color. You have to see some honeycomb.
yeah. It's like music. Like, the guitar was only introduced into Irish music relatively late. The
Mhm.
guitar was introduced into Irish music by the Clancy brothers in the 60s. So we
Yeah,
didn't have people banging away on guitars.
yeah,
We had fiddle, we had wind instruments, we had bowron, we had voice, we had harp. But now, if you asked anybody, did Irish music always, when did Irish music get a guitar? They'd probably think it was in the 19th century or something.
yeah.
Things
Because I
change. The
always,
language
yeah,
changes.
there is a question here from Laura, and it actually echoes back to something we had been talking about a couple of days ago. Laura was saying there seems to be some parallels with the bohus sweater industry in Sweden. And the reason that triggered is made me think of you had been talking about Fair Isle and the Fair Isle industry and the parallels that's got with Aran knitting as well. So I think they all start kind of out of a financial necessity, and
Yeah, that's interesting. Uh, yeah, Ireland had, as we know, had it's now a knowledge-led economy, but up until the advent of tourism and free education, which was a huge game changer, came in 1973. Then young people could become accountants and architects, even if they were from the most working class background. They could go to university. It transformed Ireland and also it was the beginning of the end for a lot of the textiles, because what girl who could be an architect or a lawyer now would choose to sit at home with her mother and make Aran sweaters?
mhm.
So that I'm not lamenting. I'm not a Luddite. Change is good, but here, so we have a knowledge-led economy. So we're moving away from that, and when we're looking at the way Irish knitting supported communities right up until the late 80s, even beyond to some degree, and it still does now. It started out of poverty, it provided employment, and it did it so well that pattern was replicated in Scotland. The Congested District Board, which was started here in Ireland in the late 1800s was so successful. I'm not saying successful that everyone was rolling in money, but they did have a bit of money, you know. It was rolled out in Scotland in the same areas with the same problems, traditional fishing communities, sparsely populated, you know, no, very little industry or none, bleeding out their youth through emigration. So that's where the Scottish knitting thing, and Fairall was actually knitted in Donegal before Aran. The Fairall sweater was popularized by King Bertie. It is Bertie, isn't it? The one
And
who
yet would
advocated.
never be associated with Ireland.
Yes, that's right. But there's always been a very strong connection between Scotland and Ireland, because Irish people used to go and work there, used to migrate there to
Yeah.
work on
It's
farms,
not
and
very far. Like it's actually, it's, you know, the
yeah,
distance is not great
and the
between the
language
two.
is very similar.
Yep.
So there's
I hadn't
yeah,
realized how
and the
similar it
music.
was until I'm embarrassed to say this, Outlander. I was listening to the audiobook and they were speaking, and because you're listening and the Irish, the Scots Gaelic was being spoken, and I'm like, why are they speaking
Why are they
Irish?
speaking Irish? It's so similar.
It's incredible, like same
Yeah,
words pronounced the same way. I had no idea until I heard it. There's
yeah.
very,
There's a
very similar.
very big connection,
Yeah.
and a big connection with some of the political struggles as well, although it resolved itself in a different way over there.
Hmm.
And after the tsunami in Japan, a small fishing community decided to take to knitting Arans.
Oh,
They,
really?
yeah, the woman who ran the business, I'm not sure if she still does, she came over to the Aran Islands to study the model, and she went around Ireland, and she had a look, and she brought Aran knitting and Aran patterns to these women in Japan, and they began to knit after the tsunami had devastated their community.
It's really
And
interesting.
they make beautiful, beautiful handmade knits. You see, perhaps that whole connection of people making beautiful things with their hands, beautiful things in textiles with their hands. You know, it's not just about lifting us up out of poverty. It's a much higher thing. It's a way that people can communicate. There's a
Hmm.
communication implicit in all of that. And when you get the garment, you're connected to their story. And
Hmm.
it's a different story, and it's a tangible connection. You know, when you're talking about these small communities producing these things that have so much of their personality in them, as every handmade thing can
Hmm.
carry. You know, this is you're connecting with this, and I love those parallels around the world, because anything that this thing of always looking for what's special about our culture, I love to look for our commonalities,
Hmm.
and how the similar story is repeated around, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm an
Yeah.
awful waffler, so feel free to cut me off.
No, no, it's absolutely, it's such a joy to listen to you talk, Vaughan. It's like you're just, yeah, you just seem to really get to the, yeah, get to the substance of what you're talking about. It's lovely to listen to. There's a few comments here. Some of them I don't think you're going to necessarily have the answer to all of these, but I'll kind of throw them up. Um, there was, where is it? Carol Rowlands was asking, did joining the EU affect wool mills and subsidies to the industry? No idea if
Yes.
you have okay, I'll open.
Yes, but joining the EEC, it was called then, in the early 1970s, did devastate Irish production and making, because we had been protected by tariffs. Now, tariffs are not a good policy. They're not a progressive policy. We were under De Valera at the time in the 1950s. The Irish listeners will know what I'm talking about. Ireland was a very repressive place, and it was trying to develop its culture in a kind of rage-filled way against having been colonized for so long.
Mhm.
And it wasn't a positive vision. It was like, let's shut down the borders, let's impose tariffs on goods. But it had an amazing, strong, supportive uh, uh, um, benefit for all of our woolen mills, because it
Mhm.
was more expensive to buy imported clothing. we were still wearing clothes. It supported local designers, it supported local weavers, and it supported local knitters and spinners, because we were wearing designs made by Irish designers, many of which were actually great as well, produced here in little factories on Thomas Street and the Liberties in Dublin or whatever. And when the tariffs were lifted, that was part of the deal of joining the EEC. The tariffs were lifted, the low-cost imports came in. It was with a view to developing other countries. That was the broader vision, and it did. It gave them wealth, as textiles always do. But when it came in, Irish people didn't have enough loyalty to their own brand. They wanted the new, they wanted the different, they wanted the cheaper.
Yep.
But if it wasn't for the Americans and the Germans and the Japanese, we'd have nothing left, because every woolen mill would have closed. But they'd already established such great connections with the export market.
Yeah, that kept it going.
And it was a little bit above a premium. It was never mass production. So they weren't threatened by the import of mass production, because they were never mass production. Actually, if you want to look at it in a slightly different way, during the EEC 1970s, the beginning of the fall, right? But the biggest fall and the hardest crash was in the 90s, when we had more money than sense, and everyone was just on the buy more, buy more, buy more. And all the Zaras and the globalization of fashion, which, don't get us. That's another whole YouTube rant.
Absolutely. But what's interesting is you were talking about the knitting skipping a generation, and I actually think that there's it's not quite there yet, but things are definitely, with the idea of more sustainability,
Yes,
more slow fashion,
people are turning their backs on
it's
that.
it's slowly it's getting there, because
Absolutely.
people are thinking more about where things came from,
Yeah.
how they were produced, and how
Oh,
long
yeah.
would it last, and can I repair it so that I can keep wearing it in 10 years' time?
Yeah.
And the quality of what you put into it being very important, as opposed to what does it just look like. But that
This is something that we can really be happy about. Anyone who's interested in the environment, interested in making, interested in culture and design, can really take some comfort, even if it's only a niche movement, that the younger people are totally turned on to making and
I've
keeping.
got Kate Daly has
Thanks for
got
your questions. It's so interesting to hear from you. I wish I could see your faces, but
we've got Kate Daly has got a couple of really interesting points here. She said the making of Irish lace was just exhibited on the Aran Islands in June, and also research about woven Galway shawls. So, and our next one, the Stables in Dublin, is doing some interesting collaborative work with the Irish weavers and knitters. And this, I think we kind of talked about this point as well. It's why the Gaelic was also banned. So anything culturally defined aspect of Irishness, which we actually did talk a little bit more about that.
That's particularly under the penal codes and under the 18th century.
And then there was.
Thank you for those great. Thank you for sharing that. That's very interesting. There's lots going on textiles in Ireland at the moment.
As a question here, and this might be a little tangential, it was, where did Welsh knitters and history fit into this history?
And the answer is, I don't know.
Yeah, because I was because the only, not quite the same thing, but Cornwall, and in particular any of the Gansey styles would have gone all along the coast, like from Scotland, all the way down. But that's a very specific style. That's the one where it's knits and purl stitches, and it's very specifically fisherman and functional, but it's been kind of reproduced a little bit more. But Wales is a little off of that. And there's a couple of people here saying, thank you very much for all of your waffling. Keep waffling freely.
Thank you. I do have one comment on the knitting and the spreading and the making of cottage industries. Very strong cottage industry in Ireland with knitting right up until the 80s, as I said. But I have heard and read, but though I haven't actually researched it, that many people in Scotland, because the Aran became so popular. Look at Marilyn Monroe wearing it. The Kennedys were wearing it. It was huge, huge. It had a huge market. That Scottish people were actually knitting Aran sweaters for the Aran market. which this is something that I've been told anecdotally, and I haven't actually researched it. But if that is the case, then that would also explain why, you know, there's such a crossover in people's heads. Is it Scottish? Is it Irish? You know, the answer is a little of both, perhaps. Also to say that Celtic knitting and Viking knitting, there's a term in knitting called Viking knitting. There is
Never
no
heard
such
that.
thing as Viking knitting. The Vikings in Ireland used to do something called nelle binding. That's my excellent Danish accent, and it's a kind of form of hooking.
I've
It's got
seen that. I've seen it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
so
it's closer
that's
to a
what they
crochet
call.
hook, really, is
It's
it?
closer to it's a kind of
Yeah.
knotting. Yeah, it's not knitting at all. So that's called Viking knitting. So if you hear that term and you think dating goes back to Viking times in Ireland, it doesn't.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um,
It spread up into Ireland relatively late.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Vaughan, would you like me to share before we finish? You gave me a slide with your phone number and your email address. Do you want me to
Oh,
share that?
yes, that would be lovely. And
Um,
also, this is my little book, Irish Aran.
yes, there you go.
And I do still like it, which is something. And it's got lots of nice pictures in it. And it tells the whole story. And you might enjoy it. If I'm around, if you're in Ireland, I can sign it. I also want to just say a couple of things, two things. First of all, little disclaimer. I'm quite tired today, and I have a little bit of a learning difficulty with numbers. So it's not impossible in the least that I've completely muddled up any numbers I've given you. It's not that I don't know them. It's that they don't come into my head. I have a learning difficulty with numbers. So it'll be in the book. So please don't bother getting in touch if I said 17th century instead of 18th century. Just buy the books and it'll be
We'll
right in the
forgive you.
books.
And the book
Yeah.
is wonderful.
And
It's well worth a
oh,
read if
thank
you
you.
enjoy history and if you want to learn a little bit more about Irish knitting or about the Tweed. It's a really, really good resource to be able to find a
Thank
bit
you.
more
I
on.
enjoyed talking to everybody and learning about it. And yeah, it's been great to chat to you as well, Carol. Any more questions or are we done?
I think that most of them are through. I'm just popping this up here, but while that's there, I'm just going to flick through. I think that most of the questions I've kind of fired through as we're doing it. Like there was a little bit, yeah, I
That,
think most of them have kind of come through. We've done
oh,
pretty good.
fantastic. That
Uh,
number there obviously would need the Irish code in front of it. Yeah.
Yes, but they're like most booksellers would have them around. And in terms of tangentially, anyone who's on here as well, if you are interested in more Irish knitting and all the rest, our Celtic Knits Club is opening this evening as well. But you'll be able to see that on the website tonight. But Vaughan, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure, and I suspect we may be on again. So if anyone has anything in particular that you'd love to hear from Vaughan, pop it up in the comments if you're watching this afterwards on YouTube, and I'm sure we'll be able to persuade her to come in and chat with us again.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody out there, you wonderful makers. And it's great that you're so interested and involved. And I'm sending you all my love. Have a good day wherever you are. Lovely to kind of meet you. Thank you,
Thank
Carol.
you. I think my stream is ending. I have before been known to say, "Oh, I'm all done," and start chatting and then rely